And now back to China and through some very interesting eyes. Professor Niall Ferguson has been dubbed one of the top 100 most influential people by Time magazine and is probably the world's best known economic historian. He's the author of many books like Empire, The Ascent of Money and recently Civilization, The West and the Rest. His latest production, Triumph and Turmoil, is a major TV series on China. I spoke to him from Harvard University, where he's the Lawrence A. Tisch Professor of History. Niall Ferguson, welcome to the programme.
Nice to be here.
Now, you've spent much of last year in China on the ground. What struck you most about the place?
I think what struck me more than the obvious economic transformation is the major political dilemma that China now faces as it creates an ever more prosperous and indeed in many places middle-class society. I think China is realizing that it can't carry on indefinitely with a political system inherited from Chairman Mao. So that strikes me as the real key question here. Where does China go? Not economically, that's kind of obvious, but politically.
Well, we see from here China grappling with things like property bubbles, but you also talk about a rise of Chinese nationalism, particularly amongst the very young. What do you mean by that?
Well, there are two forces at work, Tiki. One is the economic volatility coming out of the global financial crisis. The Chinese threw a huge amount of money at the problem and very successfully avoided a major recession of the sort that we saw in the West. But in the aftermath, they ended up with a housing bubble of their own. And the story of the last year has really been a struggle to bring that under control. Now we see property prices falling quite fast, and there's considerable anxiety about a possible hard landing in China. While that is going on, you have simultaneously the phenomenon of increasing nationalism, which is not just the official nationalism that you saw at the Olympics 4 years ago. It's also a kind of unofficial nationalism, particularly among young people, particularly students, actually. And you encounter this if you go online and see some of the ultra-nationalistic videos that these kids make.
You've actually argued that Chinese leaders, in order to deal with these tensions, are encouraging this nationalism and combining it with an expansionism to solve the problem, because you don't actually think China is going to implode at all, do you?
No, I don't. And I think those who predict an implosion or a China crash are engaged in a kind of wishful non-thinking. They kind of wish it would happen, but they don't really have much evidence for it. And I think the real question is, which direction will China take? Will it move in what we would call a Western direction, moving towards something more like representative government? Or will it use nationalism and expansionism to try to distract people from domestic political change? That is really unclear at the moment. What's for sure is that China is expanding, and that's something that I encountered when I travelled recently to Zambia, a country I know that you know well. It's really very impressive just how big a Chinese presence there now is in places like sub-Saharan Africa.
There's also some debate now about the rise of state capitalism as opposed to market capitalism, state capitalism having done China pretty well through the financial crisis. But we've now got some leading thinkers suggesting perhaps state capitalism is the better model. What do you make of that?
No, I think this is doubly wrong, actually. It's doubly wrong because, one, Western economies have a pretty big role played by the state. And if you didn't believe that before the crisis, you certainly believe it now, given all we've seen by the Fed, by the government in the form of bailouts. State capitalism is alive and well and living in North America and in Europe. The other key point is that in China, the trend is still away from the state towards the market. That's been true since 1978. And if you talk to some of the key economists in Beijing, people who are very influential with Hu Jintao, the current president, their view is that China needs to go further in the direction of the market. Indeed, one thing that we may see happening in the next few years is a fresh wave of privatization as the big state-owned enterprises are dismantled. There are those in Beijing, particularly at the People's Bank of China, who would dearly like to see that.
Now, of course, a key part of that state capitalism is the sovereign wealth fund, and there's quite a debate here in Australia about Chinese investments through sovereign funds. How should Australia position itself?
I think the Chinese are, frankly, shopping all around the world for hard assets, mines, as well as arable land. It's not just Australia. And I think one shouldn't demonise the Chinese for doing this. They're acting perfectly rationally, recognising the limits of their own agricultural and mineral capacity. And I think most countries just need to be hard-headed in their negotiations with the Chinese. What we don't want to see is what does happen in some African countries, namely that China gets natural resources at bargain basement prices by doing deals with corrupt governments and building a couple of football stadiums in return. I don't think that's going to be the fate of Australia. So no, I don't think we should be too alarmed by this. I think this is something that's absolutely inevitable and in China's interests, and probably also in the interests of the people selling the natural resources.
And let me ask you about Europe. We've got upcoming French elections and the possibility of the Sarkozy-Merkel axis disappearing. What do you think China will do about this? Do you see China supporting Europe more and perhaps buying influence?
Well, first of all, don't write off Nicolas Sarkozy. Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, described him to me the other night as a political wizard, and he may yet pull off a surprise victory. But clearly the Chinese watch with concern as Europe lurches from crisis to crisis. And although they've been resistant to any kind of open-ended bailout of the Eurozone, I think behind the scenes the Chinese have been quite important buyers of European bonds. It's hard to measure that because they do it indirectly through London. But they watch this closely. It's not in China's interests for the euro to fall apart. They would very much like to diversify their international reserves out of dollars.
Niall Ferguson, we are out of satellite time, unfortunately. A great treat to have you with us. Thank you so much for joining us.